Right, so it's my final talk before I go for the day. But I want to give and the reason why I've come away from the crowds is because I want to give a memoriam to Salwan Monika, who you may know has recently been killed in a jihadist attack in Sweden. And I want to give a little talk about his life, you know, as an ode to him, because he is a Christian martyr, and it's important that we remember our martyrs and we celebrate them. And so I want to do that, and I want to do it away from the hustle and the bustle. And so I'm not interested, this is just for the camera really, rather than for the crowd. So his full name is Salwan Saba Matthew Monika, and he is an Iraqi refugee who ended up in Sweden. And he was a former paramilitary operative for the Popular Mobilization Force, or the PMF, when he was fighting in Iraq against ISIS. And when he came to Sweden as a refugee, he obviously gained notoriety for his burning of Qurans in protest and to try and raise awareness about the danger of Islamists. He was born in a town called Karakosh, which is a Syrian town under Islamist occupation as part of the Arab colonization of the Middle East. And it's in northern Iraq in the province of Nineveh. As I say, he was an ethnic Assyrian, which are the indigenous people of the land, and he was a Syriac Catholic. Now, during the Iraqi civil war, when Christians were being persecuted, Monika wasn't a coward. Monika was the kind of courageous, muscular Christian that I'm talking about. Because when Islamic State erupted in Iraq, Monika didn't run. Monika joined the Assyrian Patriotic Party, and he ended up working as a security guard for the party's headquarters in Mosul. Now, according to the Iraqi government and other sources, he had to flee his hometown in 2012 after the local court found him guilty of causing a wrongful death during a car accident. And God knows best the truth of that. And he'd been sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in Badush prison. After the fall of Mosul to ISIS in 2014, Monika, as I say, joined the Popular Mobilization Forces to fight against ISIS. So we're talking about a brave Christian man here, a man not frightened to defend the church, not frightened to defend his community, not intimidated by jihadis. And he specifically appeared in videos in military uniform as part of the Christian unit, which was known as the Spirit of God, Jesus, Son of Mary Battalion, or the Kataib Ruach ala Isa ibn Miriam. He brandished firearms, he pledged his allegiance to the Imam Ali Brigades, because the Shia Confederation was the only larger group of body that had a real chance in pushing back ISIS. But he was in the Christian brigade of that. Now, the Imam Ali Brigades are known to have had close connections to Iran and are considered an Iranian proxy. The brigades were also accused of committing war crimes and engaging in sectarian violence. And when it comes to Muslim war bands, I can well believe that, but I find it unlikely that Christian war bands would have done so. However, God knows the truth of it. Eventually, Monika became affiliated with the Syriac Assembly Movement, a political party that received its support from the government of Kurdistan. And so I want to say to Kurds, the Christians are your best allies. Stop seeing the Assyrian Christians as a group to persecute or a group to oppress, but see them as a group that you should associate with and should support in mutual collaboration to the creation of a greater Kurdistan. Monika went on to found the Syriac, was one of the founders of the Syriac Democratic Union and the Falcons of the Syriac Forces in 2014, which was an armed militia which was affiliated with the Christian militia Babylon Brigade, the armed wing of the Babylon movement. In 2017, Monika was involved in an internal power struggle with fellow Babylonian movement leader Ryan al-Kildani, which he lost, and this may have played a role in why he had to flee Iraq. However, as a Christian and as a Christian militant, he wasn't finished trying to help or defend Christians. When he fled to Germany and lived within the Schengen visa, he announced his apostasy and became an atheist from Christianity. In April 2018, Monika applied for a refugee visa to Sweden, and he was since then registered as an Iraqi refugee until April 2021, when he was granted a 3-year temporary resident permit, which was due to expire in April. Monika was denied a permanent residence necessary to acquire Swedish citizenship because he had lied in his asylum application by denying that he was in the Imam Ali Brigades, claiming that he was associated with the political branch and not the paramilitary branch of the movement. After he was granted residence permit in Sweden, while still under investigation for his association for the pro-Iranian militant group, he threatened a man with whom he shared the accommodation with a knife, which resulted in him being convicted for an unlawful threat the following year, and he was sentenced to probation and community service. In 2023, Monika arranged a series of demonstrations against Islam. Monika posted dozens of videos online, often the majority Muslim countries' names in Arabic as hashtags, prior to the Quran burnings. During these demonstrations, he desecrated Qurans and burned them with police protection and legal permission. The Quran burnings were accompanied by attacks against Monika. Also in 2023, the Swedish Migration Agency decided that Monika was to be expelled from the country due to threats against him in Iraq. Let that sink in for a second. They wanted to expel him because of threats against him. In other words, the Liberal government was being intimidated by Islamists abroad, just like they were with Pakistani confessors who were charged under the blasphemy law that the British and other Western governments wouldn't give sanctuary to. He was deported from Norway on the 27th of March 2024, and it was reported that Monika had left Sweden for Norway to seek asylum. Shortly after his departure, there were reports in social media that he had been found dead in Norway, but the Norwegian police appeared to deny the rumours. On the 4th of April, Norwegian police announced that they had arrested Monika on the 28th of March and they planned to deport him. Monika died on the 29th of January 2025 at the age of 38 after being shot. It happened in his own home in Södertälje during a TikTok live stream. 5 arrests have been made in connection to the shooting, according to the Swedish prosecutor. Just want to correct myself. I was under the impression that he was a Christian and therefore a Christian martyr. I wasn't actually aware of his apostasy from Christianity. However, The death of Monika in Sweden tells us a number of things that we need to consider. And the first is that he was driven because he had experienced the threat of Islam in real time. ISIS, when Monika was a Christian, was determined to wipe out the Christian populations of Iraq. I think someone who has faced down an Islamist movement determined to wipe you out might have a justifiable reason to being an opponent of Islam. And there is a great irony in the debate and the discussion around Monika that people are calling him an Islamophobe for warning about the dangers of Islam and Islamists after he has been killed by Islamists because of Islam. There is a great irony in that. And it exposes the naivety and the ignorance of our liberal elites who refuse to see and accept that we have a threat within every Western democratic society coming from Islamists who swim within the pool of Muslims. And notice the distinction that I made there. We should understand Monika's death and life as a warning to us all. He died trying to warn us of a danger that our elites do not wish to recognize. The irony of being offended that the Quran should be burned when Uthman himself burned early copies of the Quran, and it is a normal practice to burn Qurans as a way of getting rid of them because you can't just chuck them in the bin, demonstrates something of an irony. Now, I personally don't agree with desecrating Qurans for the shock value or to insult people. However, I do agree in a democratic society that you should have the right, so long as it's yours and you own it, to desecrate a Quran if you want to. Why do I say that? I say that because the same liberal elites that have arrested a man in Manchester because he burnt a Quran in protest at the murder of Monika are the same liberal elites who did nothing at all when a art piece in Scotland was a Bible that people were encouraged to deface and to desecrate. They do nothing at all when people desecrate the Bible or when they stick a crucifix in a vat of piss and call it art. In other words, our liberal elites are completely okay with Christian symbols being desecrated and they do nothing. But if you desecrate a Quran, they do something and they arrest you. Why is that happening? It is because our liberal elites live by an economy of fear. They fear Islamists. They fear the reaction of the Muslim community, and so they kowtow to that community and give them special protections that they do not give Christians or other groups. This hypocrisy needs to be called out in the most forceful terms. The burning of the Quran that Monika did and the assassination that resulted from it is meant to intimidate us. It's meant to make us obey Islamic sensibilities. And I want to say it failed. Because of Monika's assassination, since that moment, thousands of Qurans have since been desecrated, burned, and desecrated in other ways as protests. And those protests are legitimate. And I call for the release of the man that is a friend of Monika, who desecrated a Quran in Manchester. I call for his release because in a democracy, you can protest. And if someone desecrated a Quran, he would not be arrested, as exemplified by the multiple examples of where Bibles have been desecrated by gay activists, for instance. We must recognize, all of us, but I say particularly to the church, that our enemies have demonstrated their resolve to win. They have demonstrated how determined they are to win. We must match their resolve with equal vigor. We must match their resolve to win by being willing to beat them. Anything less will result in defeat. We must be utterly committed to the destruction of the Islamist movement wherever it is in the world, and certainly within our society. We must not be afraid to expel from our nations anyone with any Islamist sympathies. We must not be afraid to take sides. And the problem with our liberal elites is that because of their ideological blind spot, they always go off kilter whenever the Islamist threat raises its head, and then start talking about the political right. Even though over 90% of all terrorist deaths are the result of Islamist activism, not because of activism from the political right. But yet our elites talk about these two things as if they are equal threats. And I want to say as a Christian that the extreme right is a threat to the church, and we must oppose it. Ethno-nationalists go into churches in America and shoot Christians because they're black. And so as Christians, we must oppose ethno-nationalism. But we must recognize what is the bigger threat. The Islamist network are marshalling entire armies in Somalia, in Iraq, in the Philippines, in Kashmir, and in northern Nigeria, and a number of other places. We Christians must recognize, and Western society must recognize, the threat. It's said that for every soldier on the front line, you need 4 people supporting them from behind. The fact that there are so many Islamist armies active in the world demonstrates the widespread support for the Islamist ideology. We must not be afraid to face it down square on. And distractions about the political right and the alt-right, like going after Tommy Robinson, a peaceful right-wing activist, is a complete distraction from the real threats in our society. Europe is dying the death of 1,000 cuts because of the incompetence and the cowardice of our political elites. We must drive our political elites out democratically and replace them completely. Leading civil servants, leading police officers, the entire political class, leading judges must all be removed from office and replaced by people who actually want to defend the West in a Trumpian-like manner. The cowardice of the political elites will be the death of us all. They will drag us over the cliff. We must reject and replace our political elites in every sphere, and we must commit ourselves not to defending liberal secularism, but to the idea of replacing liberal secularism with a new Christendom. Because the liberal elites have used up the full resource of their ideological framework, and they do not have an answer to the Islamist threat. But Christians have defeated Islamists before, many times and in many places, because our ideology allows us to call them what they are and to deal with them as they are. And so we must commit ourselves not to more liberal secular humanism, but to the idea of a new Christendom. We Christians must draw courage from our faith, because Christianity tells us that there is a life in the world to come, and that what happens in this world is not the end, and that there is a future for us that is secured by Jesus Christ, and that we must offer up our souls and bodies to establish his kingdom in the here and the now as his holy priests, as his royal nation. And in the knowledge that even our deaths can serve his church, we must boldly strive to remove not just the Islamist threat, but also the liberal cancer that enables that Islamist threat. In closing, I want to make it clear that everything that I say should be interpreted as you using the fullness of your democratic and legal rights in every conceivable and imaginable way to deal with this threat. And I want to say to the church that because of a lack of leadership and vision by our church leaders, we are not using up the fullness of the space and the fullness of our legal rights within this democratic system to oppose the Islamist threat. And so, Christians, you must learn the fullness of your rights and the full possibilities of what you can say so that you can push back against the Islamists. The Labour Party is intimidated by the Muslim vote. The Labour Party is in cahoots with the Islamist vote, because if they don't kowtow to that Islamist vote, they know they are going to lose seats. Islamists are penetrating the political state and are using it for the agenda of political Islam. We must play the chess that they are playing, and we must do the same. Right now, our Christian congregations are colouring in crayon while the enemies of the church are playing chess. We need a better quality of leader that has a bigger, broader and better, more dynamic and more courageous vision than the local parochial, congregational, obsessed, narrow vision that so many of our church leaders have.